Hello and welcome to episode 38, Remastered. In the last episode, I introduced the subject of ecology, and I mentioned the 5 levels of scale that ecologists use to study the world. These levels begin with the behavioral ecology of the individual organism, and then it moves up to the population ecology of groups, or herds, or swarms. And then you reach community ecology, which includes multiple different species all interacting together in a large area. The last levels are the ecosystem ecology of species interacting with their abiotic environment and the sum total global ecology of the world's biosphere. The following episodes in this series on ecology will cover all of these different levels, starting today with behavioral ecology. Now, before I get into the details of studying behavioral ecology, I have to define what it is that scientists mean when they say behavior. You might think that it's obvious, but essentially, an organism's behaviors are the actions that it makes in response to stimuli. When the organism is hungry, it seeks out food, and so the behavioral ecologist will look at how the organism goes about acquiring food. When the organism seeks shelter, it burrows a hole, or builds a nest, or a web, or a hive, or anything else. It makes a dam, or a mound. It makes something to protect it from the harsh environment, from predators, and from those that would steal their stored food or their eggs. The behavioral ecologist looks at how the organism interacts with other members of its species, whether it be in an aggressive confrontation or a competition, a cooperative effort to hunt or migrate, or how the organisms communicate to each other to indicate the direction of a food source or the location of a predator. While this latter group of behaviors includes a larger population, and so you might think it's a population ecology, and to a degree it is, the behavioral ecologist looks at how the individual behaves within the group. And that's pretty important too, because just like the water molecules that make up a wave, if you look at the behaviors of individuals, it can give you a clue as to the behavior of the group. Not always, but sometimes. Anyway, these are all behaviors, whether it's a human doing it, or a fox, or a fish, or an insect, or a bear, or a bird, or whatever. I'm listing animals here, but I should clarify that plants can exhibit behaviors too. The sunflower turning to face the sun as it moves across the sky is a behavior, as is the Venus flytrap clamping down on some poor little bug that happened to activate its sensors. Now, scientists generally study behavior in animals as opposed to plants because animals are able to give much faster and much more obvious responses to stimuli. Plants move slowly, over the course of hours and days, but animals respond virtually the moment you do something, like offer them food, or make a threatening gesture, or try to touch them. Behavior is a really complex, dynamic, multidimensional thing, and we can never really know what an animal is thinking, or what its life experience is like. The best we can do is try to contextualize the behaviors as inclusively as possible by asking the right questions. Since 1961, behavioral ecologists have tried to understand an organism's behavior by asking 2 kinds of questions: proximate questions and ultimate questions. The proximate questions are those that address the proximate causation of the organism's behavior, with respect to the nitty-gritty details involving genes, and hormones, and neural mechanisms. For example, if you were to look at the sense of smell in a great white shark, the proximate question you might ask is, how does the shark have such a potent sense of smell? And the answer would involve details about the shark's enlarged olfactory bulb in its brain, and the nasal cavity, which is used exclusively for smelling stuff, whereas a human nasal cavity, in contrast, is used for both smelling and breathing. These are all proximate details to answer a proximate question. Ultimate questions, and ultimate causations, as the name suggests, address a less technical and a more big-picture perspective. The ultimate questions seek to understand why certain traits or behaviors happen in an evolutionary context. In the case of the great white shark, is having such a profoundly effective sense of smell helpful to their survival? Does it serve an evolutionary purpose? In this case, with the great white sharks and their acute sense of smell, The answer is an obvious yes. Another ultimate question would address the evolutionary origin of the shark's sense of smell, which perhaps evolved as part of their specialization as a predator in a literal ocean environment, where the nearest food might be miles away. And so, being able to detect the faintest traces of food becomes really important when everything is so spread out, and it takes a long time to find something and make a major kill. In such circumstances, a string of unsuccessful hunts can lead to starvation, so the shark has endured a strong evolutionary pressure to be able to successfully track down prey at great distances. As I said a moment ago, behaviors are very dynamic. They're complex. Some behaviors are flexible, while others aren't. Now, this is another way of organizing behavior, based on flexibility and the required amount of learning. Flexibility, in the context of behavior, is the capacity of the behavior to have variation in its expression or its utility. For example, in humans, the sneeze and the yawn are two innate behaviors with very low flexibility. Pretty much all sneezes and yawns are the same, more or less. Sneezes might sound different from person to person, but the physical mechanism of rapid air expulsion to clear the nose and the throat is the same. When you're sneezing, it's pretty hard to control how intense the sneeze is going to be. Likewise, yawning might be louder or quieter, longer or shorter depending on the person, but the physical mechanism of an almost unstoppable urge to open the mouth and let out a slow exhaling yawn is all the same. These are called fixed action patterns, because they show no flexibility. They're fixed responses to certain stimuli. Yawning is particularly interesting because it's a physical response that's caused by being tired, or by being bored, or even just by seeing someone else yawn. Fixed action patterns exist in all kinds of species. The backward escape jump of a kangaroo rat is one such fixed action pattern, as are the various rituals and mating dances that male birds perform in the presence of fertile female birds. The other part of behaviors that I mentioned are their capacity to be learned, or the amount of learning that goes into developing the behavior. Speech is a great example of a learned behavior. Speech is also a very flexible behavior too, because speech can be used for a huge variety of purposes. You can use speech to calmly discuss ideas and to logically negotiate, to communicate on a project and to cooperate with teammates, or you can also use speech a little more aggressively to discourage an attacker, or you can use speech a little more sensually to romance a lover. Speech is both learned and flexible, which puts it at the opposite of both spectrums from sneezing and yawning, which are both inflexible and innate. I know I'm kind of throwing vocab words at you, but try and follow me here. Innate means that the behavior isn't learned. A sneeze and a yawn is innate because you don't have to learn how to do it. It's instinctive. You instinctively know how to do it. It's literally a behavior that's more or less encoded in your DNA and your physiology. This is a trend that holds true for most behaviors. Those that are innate are also generally inflexible, while those behaviors that are learned are often much more flexible. And that makes sense intuitively, because in the process of learning a skill or behavior, there's the inevitable emergence of permutations and specialized styles and various ways of expressing that learned skill. With all their learned and innate, flexible and inflexible behaviors, the animal generally has a number of responses to a certain situation. The animal responds to stimuli from its environment, to the things that it sees and hears and smells happening around it, and it makes decisions. Other times, the animal will sense a stimuli coming from within it, like physical pain or sleepiness, and this too will encourage certain behavioral decisions. As far as we can tell, the animal makes choices that prioritize its survival, and then the survival of its immediate offspring. The animal has to make an instinctive cost-benefit analysis of its immediate situation, like a deer that sees a predator approaching but at a great distance. The deer has to decide, do I leave now and keep the distance advantage but abandon all of these tasty leaves that I'm eating, Or do I stay here and continue eating food for a few minutes before leaving, even though that might put me at more risk of the predator? Or do I stay here eating these tasty leaves until I can literally hear the predator creeping around me before I try and make a last-minute daring escape? The deer has to make this cost-benefit analysis. It has to weigh the cost of leaving the food source versus the benefit of avoiding a predator, which in this case might seem obvious that the deer should leave as soon as possible. I mean, after all, there's food everywhere, but avoiding predators is generally a more effective policy when it's consistently followed. Another example of a cost-benefit analysis comes from the shark, which I've mentioned. The shark has to decide whether the scent that it detects is worth following to the source. Alright, so now that I've laid out the context and I've thrown a couple vocab words at you, it's time for me to explore 5 aspects of animal behavior. First and foremost, an animal has to eat. It has to find food and feed itself to sustain its body and to stay alive. Second, the animal needs a place to live, or at least it needs some place to feed and reproduce with a modicum of safety. Third, the animal needs ways to communicate, and fourth, it needs to know when to cooperate to maximize its benefit in the environment. Lastly, the animal has to find a suitable mate and reproduce, so as to pass on their genes to the next generation, to perpetuate their genes through time with another pulse of this organic chemical wave. Okay, so let's start with the first aspect, which is how an animal feeds itself. When an animal searches for food, it's exhibiting a behavior called foraging, or browsing. A bird that's digging through the dirt for seeds or a worm is foraging. So is an insect flying around for the right kind of plant to eat. The wolf pack that's tracking and hunting a moose is foraging for food, in a manner of speaking. And the alligator that's floating motionless in the swamp, mouth open, waiting for its prey to wander too close, is foraging in its unique alligator way. Whatever tactics they use, animals generally try to be efficient. In fact, they try to maximize their efficiency, foraging in ways that optimize the amount of energy and edible material they can gather and consume versus the amount of energy that they have to expend to get it, to gather it up in the first place. This hypothesis is that animals use optimal foraging techniques to max out this efficiency. Optimal foraging strategies depend on things like the food in question, the environment, and the threat of predators. When a bird delicately picks seeds one by one out of the dirt, it's exhibiting a basic kind of optimized foraging. By spending a little time focusing on finding each individual seed and picking it up one at a time to eat, the bird can find and eat seeds at a relatively constant rate. Hypothetically, the bird could just gulp down mouthfuls of dirt and eat any seeds that happen to be there, but that has a lot of negative consequences to it, like filling the stomach with dirt. These are proximate consequences with proximate explanations. The dirt is indigestible to the bird's enzymes. The dirt would physically clog its intestinal tract. The dirt would fill up its belly before it had eaten enough seeds, and so it would feel full before it actually got enough nutrition to sustain itself, and so on. If we were to look at this situation from an ultimate perspective, our ultimate analysis would suggest that those birds who didn't bother to avoid eating dirt would suffer more because of it. And because they were suffering from this inefficient behavior, they were eventually selected against by the merciless forces of evolution until they all died out. And the only behaviors that were sustained and the only behaviors that were perpetuated were those found in the bird that would individually identify and pick out seeds, as opposed to scooping up mouthfuls of dirt. Consider these other aspects of optimal foraging. Maritime birds that eat oysters will optimize their foraging by going after oysters of medium size. This is because the smaller oysters have weak muscles, and so they can be easily opened and eaten, but because those oysters are so small, they don't really have that much meat in them. They don't offer that much in the way of nutrients, in the way of chemical energy. The larger oysters have a lot more meat in them, and so there's a lot more nutrients there. But the larger oysters also have stronger muscles and thicker shells, and the birds have to expend a lot of time and a lot of energy to try and get those shells open to get at the meat on the inside. Because it takes so much effort to open up these larger oysters, the birds generally don't bother with them, despite the heavy mass of meat inside, because it's just too energy intensive. This is why these birds will go after medium-sized oysters. The medium-sized oysters give a decent nutritional payout, a good amount of energy, and they don't require that much energy to open either. By focusing on these medium-sized oysters, their foraging is optimized. While this is good for the bird, it can lead to an interesting ecological and evolutionary consequence for the oysters. If you have an oyster population and all of the individual oysters have all this variation in their size, but then you have this predator in the form of the seabird, and the seabird is by and large only eating those medium-sized oysters, then the medium-sized oysters in this population they're going to be hurt. Their numbers are going to be reduced. And eventually, this oyster population is going to find that it has more large oysters and small oysters than anything else. And so the population is going to experience this divergence in size. And if the predatory birds keep eating all of these medium-sized oysters, and if the larger oysters and the smaller oysters for some reason prefer to breed with larger and smaller oysters respectively, then we'll start to see an evolutionary divergence. We'll start to see a sympatric speciation event in this oyster population. And this would all be due to that predatory bird preferentially choosing and eating the medium-sized oysters, and depleting the medium-sized oysters from the population. Another example is the Antarctic seals that eat krill. The krill exist in patches of various sizes and densities, and at various depths in the ocean water. It takes more energy for the seal to dive deeper and to stay down longer, but by staying down longer, the seal can potentially eat more krill. This also depends on the density of the krill patch, because if you have a sparse cloud of krill at a great depth, that's generally not worthwhile for the seal to eat. The seal would have to dive deep down, and then it would have to swim around a lot to get a decent meal because these krill are all spread out. If the seal does this, it's spending too much energy hunting. But if that deep krill swarm was really dense, then the seal could stay down for a longer time, despite the greater energy expenditure of swimming around at such a depth, as it could easily eat a lot of krill in the dense patch without having to swim around too much. The depth and the duration of the seal's dive is optimized to match the difficulty of access and the density of the krill patch. This kind of optimized foraging behavior sees the animal use its time as efficiently as possible, as its foraging behavior will generally expose it to predators, and it'll use up its energy. If the animal can gather a lot of chemical energy without spending too much chemical energy, or without overly risking itself to predation, that animal has an optimized foraging strategy, and it's going to put it at an evolutionary advantage. These advantageous, optimized foraging strategies may persist for countless generations and become a hallmark characteristic of that species' behavior. Alright, on to the next aspect. Where do animals choose to live? What kinds of shelter do they make or use? Do they live with their parents, or do they migrate away after adolescence to find a new place to live? How do groups of animals know where to migrate as the seasons change? What are the benefits of migrating, as opposed to staying in place? Well, first, let's look at the proximate causes behind animal movement through an environment. There's 3 types of proximal navigation, called piloting, compass orientation, and true navigation. Piloting is the simplest type, as piloting involves the basic recognition of landmarks and the usage of memorized pathways or corridors through the area. When a little child bird is taken on a migration by its parent, the child bird is seeing all of the landmarks that they pass over. They're seeing rivers and mountains and valleys and deserts and forests. And after just 1 or 2 migrations, this child bird has memorized the route and can take it by itself. This is just basic piloting. Compass orientation is a bit more complicated, as compass orientation involves moving variables like the sun, which rises in the east and sets in the west. The light input from the sun, in combination with the animal's internal circadian rhythm, is often enough for the animal to figure out where north is. Many species of migratory birds use both the position of the sun and the position of the stars to determine their orientation. One of the most frequently referenced stars is the North Star. When the North Star can't be seen, like on a cloudy night or during the day, these migratory birds can actually sense the Earth's magnetic field, and they use that to orient themselves. Research into birds' ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field, is still ongoing, but it seems clear now that birds have either, or both, the ability to visually perceive the magnetic field as if it were a visible wavelength of light, and they have some kind of magnetite-containing organ in their beaks that can sense magnetic fields. In fact, many species use some kind of compass to orient themselves, be it the sun, the stars, or the Earth's magnetic field. I mean, you might be surprised how many animals use the Earth's magnetic field to orient themselves. Green sea turtles use it to navigate and migrate in the oceans. And when I learned that green sea turtles can sense the magnetic field, it kind of blew me away. I didn't know that, and that's pretty incredible. The third type of navigation is called map orientation, or true navigation, and it involves the ability to find a specific location over and over again. The green sea turtles that I mentioned use the magnetosphere to help them navigate. They can somehow sense the differences in the Earth's magnetic field, the angles and the various intensities of it, and they use these differences in the magnetic field to get a grasp on where they are geospatially, geographically. Experiments have shown that these turtles can swim around entire oceans, visiting the coastlines of multiple continents, before returning to a specific location to feed or to mate. The turtles use their awareness of the magnetic field to approximate their location and navigate on a global scale, and it allows them to come back to very specific home locations after spending months or years across the Pacific. That's an amazing skill to have, and it reminds me of the various salmon species that somehow, after swimming around the ocean for years, the salmon can return to the exact river they were born in, and continue the reproductive cycle by mating and dying in it just like their parents. What are the ultimate causes behind migration and navigation? For this particular aspect of animal behavior, the ultimate causes are simple and relatively obvious. Take a look at any migrating species, and you'll see that it's chasing one or both of two things. It's either chasing food, or it's chasing good mating conditions. The populations of elk that roam Siberia and the northern reaches of North America migrate in response to the seasons. Not because they can't handle the cold weather, they can, but because their food sources are more accessible in climates with less snow cover and more plant-friendly temperatures. Salmon migrate out of freshwater lakes and streams at a certain point in their growth cycle because they can get more food in the saltwater ocean, and this lets them grow larger. The larger salmon are stronger and more likely to successfully make it back up the stream of their birth to reproduce. The monarch butterflies are a famous example of a migrating species, and their migration is amazing and extremely fascinating. During the summer, the monarch butterflies exist all over much of North America, but during the fall, when temperatures begin to drop, they begin to migrate southwards, where they spend the winter in the warm mountains of central Mexico. In the spring, they begin the northward journey once more, spreading out across a landscape that's recently muddy with melting snow. The entire migration from north to south can take multiple lifetimes. The monarch butterflies will literally reproduce en route, and their offspring will continue the migration in their stead. In effect, the whole migratory circuit consists of the entire species moving back and forth in response to the seasons, with the species trying to perpetually follow the comfortable, temperate climate band that exists between the cold of a Canadian winter and the heat of a Mexican summer. The third aspect of animal behavior is communication. Communication is a process through which the animal conveys information to another individual, or sends some kind of signal that causes a reaction or a response in the receiving individuals. Methods of communication can be both intraspecies and interspecies. An interspecies example of communication, just off the top of my head, would be like a prairie dog making a warning noise to its fellow prairie dogs that a predator, like a fox, is nearby. Or you have a bee that makes a signaling dance to the other bees in its hive, telling them how far away and in what direction food is. Or you might have a songbird that sings in order to attract a mate. Now, on the other hand, you have interspecies communication, or communication between different species, and this tends to be much less sophisticated, and much rarer. It's almost exclusively confined to confrontational encounters, like a pack of wolves that are growling at a bear encroaching on their kill. Interspecies communication is most common when you have two predators arguing over the body of a prey animal, or if you have some predators that are arguing with some scavengers over the body of a prey animal. The prey animals themselves can sometimes engage in interspecies communication. Think noises that one group of herbivores would make to another group of herbivores that happen to be encroaching on their feeding grounds or their mating grounds or something like that. I want to look more in depth at the dancing communication style of bees because it's just ridiculously fascinating. Okay, so get this. Inside of a beehive, it's pretty much totally dark. The bees don't really use vision to interact with one another because they can't see each other. But because the hive is pretty tight and it's pretty crowded in there, everyone's brushing up against each other, so they can feel each other. They can recognize the location and the movement of other bees by touching them and feeling the vibrations in the direction of their travel. Because of this dependence on a sense of touch, bees have evolved a kind of dance as a form of communication. In this dance, the bee, which is speaking, dancing, I suppose, will move its body in a circular pattern. It'll walk around in a circular pattern. Sometimes these circular patterns are interrupted by straight stretches, where the bee will walk in a straight line while wiggling or vibrating its body. Research that started in the 1930s has found that bees can communicate messages by altering the direction and the length of the straight run. So to be a little more specific, the circular dance is used to communicate the presence of food to the rest of the hive. The bee that found the food will return to the hive, and it'll do this little dance on the wall where many other bees can feel what's happening. The bee will run in circles, and this will mark the hive as a start point, in addition to allowing the bee to physically hit a bunch of other bees and get their attention. Be like, hey, I'm trying to tell you something. Then, this dancing bee will bisect these circles with a straight line, with a straight run, and a waggle of their abdomen. The direction of this straight run indicates the direction of food that the bee found. Second, the magnitude or the length of the straight run will tell the other bees just how far away the food is from the hive. If the food is close, the dancing bee will make a short waggle run, and the other bees will know that the food is nearby in whatever direction the bee was pointing, while a longer waggle run will indicate that the food is farther away. As if this wasn't cool enough, the bees will also orient their dance in relation to the sun. Because the dancing bee will do their dance on the wall of the hive, they can move left or right, and up and down. If the bee makes its straight run directly down towards the floor of the hive, this tells the other bees that the food is directly away from the sun. It says that the bees will have the sun on their backsides as they fly to the food source. That's pretty sophisticated, because as the sun moves across the sky, the direction that the bee is traveling in for the sun to be against its back will change. And so the bee that's making this dance message and telling the other bees where the food is will have to take into account not just the distance, not just the location of the food, but its relation to the sun at that particular time of day. So really quickly, you can see how this gets pretty complicated. Now the bees can also make their waggle run to the left or the right, which is perpendicular to the vertical, and this will tell the other bees that the food source is left or right relative to the sun. In this way, the bees are literally able to use their sense of touch to perceive and comprehend an angle that has been displayed on a vertical surface on the wall of the hive, and they can translate this vibrational image into movement across a horizontal plane as they go flying out in search of the food. Further research has found that bees don't just use their sense of touch to interpret the dance, but they also use a complex system of sounds and scents that give further details as to the type of food or any associated conditions, like maybe there's nearby competitors or nearby predators. Alright, so these are all proximate details, but what about the ultimate cause? As with migrating and navigating, the ultimate causes are rather obvious. An effective mode of communication has sufficient complexity to be able to convey detailed messages, like the location and nature of a food source in relation to the location of the hive and the position of the sun. This complexity allows the location of food to be accurately communicated, and it allows more worker bees, more drones, to find and harvest that food with a better success rate. More food and more nutrients for the colony means that it can grow and support a larger population, and better feed the current bees. Another ultimate cause behind the bees' dance would be the environment that necessitated a tactile mode of communication in the first place. The bees live in a dark hive, where light isn't always present, and where vision isn't particularly useful. This evolutionary context would have provided the pressure for bees to evolve a tactile, sound, and scent-based communication system. In fact, many species that live and hunt in the darkness use sounds and scents to communicate instead of visual cues, because unless you have really good night vision, visual cues don't do you a whole lot of good in the darkness. When wolves hunt at night, they communicate with a variety of howls and barks and growls and yips that convey information, like the location of prey or the location of fellow hunters, or the presence of a trap or a threat, like a bear or a hunter. All of this communication exhibits another aspect of animal behavior, which is cooperation, or the fourth animal behavior that I want to cover today. Cooperation takes many forms, and one of these forms is called altruism, which is a strange and arguably contradictory behavior seen in nature, wherein one individual will do something at risk or at a cost to itself, but that benefits or protects another individual. In evolutionary terms, altruism lowers fitness of the acting animal, but it increases the fitness of the animal that's being helped by the act of altruism. This runs counter to typical evolutionary thinking, but there are several explanations as to why animals may engage in altruism, which I'll briefly run through. First, there's the kin selection hypothesis, which argues that altruism may exist between genetically related individuals as a means of promoting the family's genes. For example, if an uncle elephant doesn't have little offspring elephant of his own, but he helps to raise his niece and nephew elephants, then his altruism is still helping propel his family's genes forward a generation. From an evolutionary perspective, he benefits through this kind of limited altruism, because his genes are still being passed on. This is kind of like a community of prairie dogs, where one individual who's keeping watch will shout out a warning that a predator is nearby. But by making this declaration, by shouting out, they expose themselves to the predator. They protect the others, but at a risk to themselves. In cases like this, animals are much more likely to risk themselves if the other individuals that they're protecting are close relatives. This not only preserves their family's genes, on a greater level, it preserves the alleles that promote this kind of self-sacrificing altruistic behavior. Some altruism isn't so selfless. Some altruism can actually be selfish, and I know that might seem a little contradictory. This kind of quasi-selfish altruism is called cooperation when it's conducted between individuals of the same species, and it's called mutualism when it's conducted between individuals of different species. In both cases, each individual will benefit from their interaction. Hyenas and wolves and other pack predators will cooperate by hunting in packs, where they can trap and kill prey that are too fast or too large for just one individual. For example, a single wolf is not going to be able to take down a grown moose, but if you have a pack of wolves, and they're all cooperating and working together and coordinating to take down the moose, they have a much better chance. Mutualist altruism comes in the form of different species helping each other out. So, for example, you'll have birds who will sit on larger animals like elephants or giraffes or alligators, and the birds will engage in mutualist altruism by picking parasites and bugs off of the larger animal's hide. Or in the case of alligators or a hippopotamus, the birds will pick out gunk from between their teeth. The birds benefit because they get a bunch of tasty snacks, and the larger animal benefits because it's getting cleaned. It's mutualism because both species mutually benefit. Another hypothesis is that some animal societies have an element of manipulative or coercive leadership that enforces altruistic behavior. Consider the bees that I've been talking about. These worker bees who find food and make their little dance messages are being very altruistic. They're essentially burning out their life energy working for the hive, specifically for the queen and her offspring. There's an element of kin selection here, as the bees in a single hive are all very closely related, but some bee queens will mate with multiple males, and so they'll have a greater genetic diversity within their hives. There's less relation between the drones, and so there's less incentive for them to be altruistic to the queen, because why should they work so hard to support everyone else in the hive if they're only related to this particular subpopulation within the hive? In response to this political fracturing, the queen and her close relatives will use pheromones to suppress mating behaviors in the drones, and if that isn't enough, they'll outright destroy any eggs laid by the drones. They'll do this, basically killing the babies of their chemical work slaves until the drones don't even bother trying to lay eggs anymore. In this way, the queen can monopolize reproduction within the hive, and the entire hive has to submit to her will. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's reciprocal altruism, which is mostly present in longer-lived species of social animals. In reciprocal altruism, the animal is working with a do good deeds and pass it on kind of mentality. Being altruistic in these long-lived social communities is more likely to get other individuals to be altruistic towards you. To put this a little more simply, if you help someone, then they're more likely to help you later on. This is a kind of altruism that's spread out through time, where good deeds don't necessarily offer immediate benefits, but instead cultivate stronger social bonds that will encourage the other individuals to return the altruism at some point in the future. This kind of reciprocal altruism has been seen in numerous species, like vampire bats, where the successful hunters of the night will share a bit of their blood meal with the hungrier, less successful hunters. Or you can also look at various species of primate, which will groom unrelated individuals to clean their hair, or they'll share food in the expectation of receiving similar altruism when they need it in the future. The last aspect of animal behavior is mate selection and reproduction. The act of mating is typically preceded by a rush of sex hormones. In some species, like the anolis lizard, the gonads grow in size in response to a surge of sex hormones, testosterone in the males and estradiol in the females. When the growth of the gonads reaches their maximum in the midsummer, the lizard's breeding season will begin. The males will spend all winter building up testosterone in preparation for this breeding season, only for their testosterone levels to crash immediately after the summer is over. It turns out that the seasonal changes themselves, with their associated changes in temperature and light level, are the chronological triggers that help regulate the cycle of sex hormones. Additionally, the female anolis lizards wouldn't enter their breeding phase unless they were courted by fertile males. As part of their mating ritual, as the males create more and more testosterone, they extend a brightly colored flap of tissue called a dewlap, which they bob up and down as a kind of mating signal. When a female sees this brightly colored dewlap bobbing up and down, it's been experimentally proven that this is a visual cue that arouses her, that arouses the female lizard and initiates her estradiol production. So a combination of incoming, spring-like climate conditions and being exposed to males with increasing testosterone levels and bobbing, throbbing dewlaps is enough to raise female estradiol levels and start the breeding season. On an ultimate level, sexual selection is used to identify healthy mates. The female will invest a disproportionate amount of energy and resources into caring for her offspring, so it follows that she tends to be choosier in who she mates with. The female needs some kind of sign or signal from the male that he is healthy and fertile before she'll choose to mate with him. This is much like the tail of a peacock, which requires a lot of nutrients and care to keep clean. A male peacock with a brilliant and shiny tail display is basically telling the female peacocks, "Hey look, I'm strong enough and healthy enough to be able to get enough food to maintain this beautiful plumage, which means that I have good genes, and so I'll be a good mate. Come mate with me." In the case of the Anolis lizard, the size and the color of the dewlap is directly correlated with the bite strength and the lizard's physical vitality. So males that have larger dewlaps are generally better fighters. They're better able to defend their territory. In fact, female lizards are more likely to choose a mate based on his ability to defend his territory than they are based on his ability to woo them by bobbing the dewlap up and down. This is because being able to defend your territory offers material advantages that improve fitness, like a stable habitat full of food with little to no competition. If the male can provide that reliable food and safety for the female, she's going to be much more likely to choose him as a mate. There are countless other examples of mating behaviors. You have rutting season in ungulates. You have the songs that are sung by songbirds trying to attract a mate. You've got the ribbits and the croaks of various amphibians who are also searching for a mate. And on and on and on. Every single animal species has to reproduce. And because of this, every single animal species has to have some kind of behavior that will enable them to find or attract and then mate with a member of the opposite sex. As you can see, there's a huge amount of variety in the ways that animals behave, and there's a lot of nuance and complexity in even the smallest gestures and movements. Animal behavior is a very complex and multifaceted phenomenon, and studying animal behaviors requires considering both proximate and ultimate influences, and even then, it can still be pretty difficult to figure out what exactly is going on, and why the animal is doing what it's doing. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed this episode on behavioral ecology, and I hope it gave you a lot of really interesting things to think about and consider. I know for me, learning about ecology has really changed the way that I see the world, and I hope that by telling you about ecology, I can make you see the world a little differently as well. If you enjoyed this episode, then give it a like. And if you're excited for the rest of the episodes in this series on ecology to come out, then hit the subscribe button so you can see them right as I post them. And as always, thanks for listening.